Didn't you know it was wrong?
No. I mean, I didn't know sex was wrong, and I definitely didn't know, being with someone 2 years under me could cost me 10 years in prison.
There's something about being a teenager that just feels huge. Every feeling is louder, every moment feels like it might shape the rest of your life. You're awkward, you're excited, terrified, curious, all at the same time. You're trying to figure out who you are, who you want to be, who your friends are, and yeah, who you might want to hold hands with, kiss, or maybe explore something more with. And that exploration, it's normal, it's human, it's something countless teens go through, quietly, nervously, imperfectly. We don't talk about that part enough. We talk about abstinence, or consequences, or fear, but we don't talk about the truth, that sexuality is a natural part about growing up, and that the real lessons teens need are about consent, communication, safety, and respect, not shame. Because the reality is, teens are going to be curious. They're going to make choices, whether you like it or not. Sometimes smart ones, sometimes impulsive ones, the same way we all did. We've all done, the same way every generation does. Most of those choices turn into memories, whether they're funny, embarrassing, sweet, or quickly forgotten. Moments you look back on later, whether fondly or maybe even embarrassingly. But imagine if one of those moments, one of those private, awkward teenage choices didn't just become a memory. Imagine if it became a criminal charge. And for one Georgia teen, that's exactly what happened. Two teenagers making a mutual, consensual decision that countless teens make every single day. A decision rooted not in malice, not in danger, but in the messy, confusing swirl of growing up and sexual exploration. But years ago, Georgia had a law, a strange, inconsistent law that treated oral sex between teens as a serious felony. And because of it, a boy with honor roll grades, a star athlete, a kid with college dreams and a whole life waiting for him, woke up to find himself labeled a felon. His name is Genarlow Wilson. And what happened to him could have happened to almost any teenager, any one of us who's ever stumbled their way through young adulthood trying to understand their own body and their own choices. This case is about adolescence, about consent, about a broken legal system, and about how one moment, one completely ordinary teenage moment, collided with an extraordinary injustice. Because one thing is certain, once your fate is sealed, there's no turning back. The gavel has fallen. I'm Nichole Mondshein, and this is Final Judgment, a deep dive into the final days, last choices, and chilling moments before execution on Georgia's death row. Some convictions unravel while some sentences are overturned. The evidence has been laid bare, the jury has spoken. But was justice truly served? For some, there's no appeal, no second chances, just the final judgment. But for others, the final judgment isn't so final after all. We all do things in our youth that we look back on and think, wow, I really had no idea what I was doing or how I even survived. That's just part of growing up, making mistakes, learning from them, and figuring out who we are and who we want to become as humans. That's the whole point of being young. You're allowed to stumble, you're allowed to fall, you're allowed to be impulsive and make mistakes. You're allowed to be human. In high school, you're in that strange, weird in-between place. You're old enough to feel everything intensely, but not old enough yet to vote, to drink, to sign a lease, or even truly understand the weight of your choices. You're still technically a kid, just a kid with bigger dreams and bigger emotions. And then on top of all of that, you throw in puberty, the hormones, the confusion, the pressure to fit in, the pressure to grow up too fast. And it's a miracle any of us survived those years at all. They're messy, they're awkward, and it's absolutely part of being a teenager, just trying to make sense of a world that suddenly feels too big and too complicated. And that's exactly where Genarlow Wilson was, standing in that weird, messy, confusing space between childhood and adulthood, trying to figure life out just like the rest of us did at that time. Genarlow Wilson wasn't just another high school kid though. He was that kid, the one teachers pointed out to as an example, the one younger students admired. In 2003, at just 17 years old, he was a senior at Douglas County High School in Georgia, balancing academics, athletics, and a full social life with the kind of ease that makes people stop and say, that kid is going places. He carried a 3.2 GPA, a solid B+ student who actually cared about his grades. And he was actually the school's first ever homecoming king, a prom prince, and the kind of well-rounded, well-liked teenager parents dream about. And that's not all. On the field, he was a star, a standout defensive back, and a force on the track. The kind of athlete who studied the game film like he was prepping for the NFL. Coaches praised his work ethic, his focus, and his determination. There's actually this story that his coaches love to tell, even to this day, about a game where Genarlow got hit so hard on a kickoff return that he actually spit up blood on the sideline. The trainer checked him for a concussion. While most kids would have likely just sat the rest of the game out, shaken, scared, but Genarlow grabbed his helmet trying to run back onto the field and help his teammates win. But they actually had to send him to the hospital instead. But that was just who he was, resilient, focused, unstoppable. And colleges were taking notice. He wasn't just getting interest from local programs. Ivy League schools like Columbia University were sending him letters, hoping he'd bring his talent and discipline to their own campuses. Genarlow had real plans for himself, real dreams, big ones, a future full of possibilities that he was actively working toward. He was a good kid, a driven kid, the kind of kid whose story should have been about scholarships, championships, and a bright future ahead of himself. He had college dreams, athletic potential, and real scholarship opportunities. His life was opening up and right in front of him, full of promise. But unfortunately, it didn't turn out that way. But here's the thing. He was also a teenager, and being a teenager means also being imperfect. It means doing things you later cringe at. He drank sometimes. He smoked sometimes. He admitted that he wasn't the perfect kid. He admitted that he could be a little cocky at times, the way talented high school athletes often are. Nothing unusual, nothing dangerous, just typical teenage behavior. And his mom knew it too. She actually overheard him and his friends whispering about a New Year's Eve party that they were planning. And like every mother who knows the trouble that can happen behind a closed bedroom door, she told her son 4 words that every teen has heard at least once by their parents. Don't do anything stupid. And here's the truth. Being stupid and being a teenager are practically synonyms. Teens push boundaries. We know this. They chase excitement, they experiment, they even possibly start exploring what intimacy is, what it looks like, and what it feels like. But exploring consensual intimacy, something countless teens do, isn't stupid, it isn't criminal, it isn't rare. It's common, it's normal, and it's part of growing up, and I bet you many of you watching did it as well. And I want to preface the key word here is consensual. 2 parties mutually agreeing to push those boundaries further and together. But for Genarlow, one night, one party, one moment just months before graduation, months before college, and maybe even a football scholarship rerouted his entire life forever. What should have been an ordinary teenage decision, a brief temporary moment of fun, collided with an extraordinary, devastating law. And everything he had worked for, everything he was becoming, began to slip away. Now, his bright future didn't disappear all at once. It dimmed slowly like a light flickering out. One court date, one headline, one legal ruling at a time. The Saturday before everything flipped upside down, Genarlow was doing what he always did, chasing his dreams. He spent the afternoon trying out for a local semi-pro football team, just a 17-year-old kid out on the field, running drills, showing off the talent everyone knew that he had. And the coaches absolutely loved him. They even exchanged numbers with him, talking about potential future opportunities. To Genarlow, it was just a normal weekend. Another step toward the future that he had been building for himself. But he had no way of knowing that this would actually be his last weekend as a free young man. That within days, everything he'd worked for, everything he'd dreamed about, would be pulled out from right underneath him. And here's the tragedy. Genarlow Wilson wasn't an exception. He wasn't a cautionary tale about recklessness or rebellion. He was a kid, a good kid, a promising kid, and what happened to him could have happened to almost any teenager. It could have easily happened to any of us. Genarlow's life changed on a night that, to most people, would have looked completely ordinary. The kind of night so many teenagers experience. A New Year's Eve party, a cheap motel room, a handful of friends, booze, in that reckless teenage belief that nothing bad ever really happens to you. It was the night of December 31st, 2003, a few hours before midnight. A group of high schoolers crowded into two adjoining rooms at a Days Inn off the interstate in Douglasville, Georgia. There was alcohol, there was weed, music was playing, people were laughing and dancing. It was the kind of teenage environment where everyone is trying to feel older than they really are, even though they're months away from graduation and still very much kids. Throughout the night, the vibe shifted the way it often does at teenage parties. Groups splintering off, people flirting, some pairing up, and yes, some consensual teenage intimacy started taking place. Nothing shocking, nothing unusual, nothing thousands of other high schoolers don't also quietly experiment with behind closed doors. But this night would be different, not because what these teens did was uniquely wild, but because of the ages involved and because one of the boys had a video camera rolling. Among the teens in that room were two girls, ages 15 and 17, and they had both at different times of the night hooked up with Genarlow Wilson. Now, everyone later agreed that the younger girl participated willingly, but under Georgia law, anyone under 16 cannot legally give consent. That single legal technicality is what turned an ordinary teenage party into a criminal investigation. Meanwhile, something separate happened with the 17-year-old girl. She had been drinking heavily that night, and the next morning she woke up confused and a little frightened. So she ended up calling her mother and reported that she believed something had happened to her. She believed that she had been R-worded, and that call brought the police to the motel where the party had occurred the night before. Officers searched the room and they found alcohol, evidence of partying, and most importantly, that video camera. And on that tape, they saw snippets of the previous night, including footage of the younger girl involved in consensual sexual activity with several boys, including Genarlow. What's still unclear, even all these years later, is whether Genarlow or the girls even knew that they were being recorded at all. None of the public records or reporting spell that out. What is obvious, though, is that at least one teen at that party knew about the camera. Someone set it up, someone pressed record, and someone left it behind. And that single decision ended up shaping this entire case that followed. Genarlow had already left the party and had gone home before police even arrived to the motel. He didn't want to miss curfew. But that didn't matter. The footage set off a chain reaction that no one in that motel room could have imagined. Prosecutors later determined there wasn't enough evidence to pursue charges related to the older girl's report, the 17-year-old girl who believed that she had been R-worded. But the footage involving the 15-year-old, well, that's where the law took over, and harshly. Even though the younger girl, the 15-year-old captured on the videotape, said she participated willingly, and even though everyone involved was a minor, even though the age gap between her and Genarlow was just 2 years, Georgia law at the time treated certain acts between minors as aggravated child molestation, a law originally written to target adults who preyed on children, not teenagers experimenting and simply hooking up with each other. A week later, on the first day back to school from winter break, police walked into Douglas County High School and arrested Genarlow Wilson in front of his classmates. Suddenly, this college-bound honor student, homecoming king, athlete, B student was facing multiple felonies. In his own words, Genarlow felt like he had the world at his fingertips one day, and the very next, his entire world was shattered, completely upside down. Imagine that. 1 minute you're finishing winter break, the next you're being led down the hallway in handcuffs like a hardened criminal. It was humiliating, shocking, and completely life-altering. And the heartbreaking part is this. What he was being arrested for wasn't violence or assault or coercion. It was consensual sexual activity between teenagers, something that, in the eyes of Georgia law at the time, was treated as a felony, every bit as serious as the crimes committed by adults against children. Over the next 8 months, prosecutors offered multiple plea deals. Every other boy involved accepted an offer, afraid of risking a jury trial and the unforgiving sentencing laws. But for Genarlow, taking a plea meant that he had to register as a sex offender and be legally barred from living at home where he had a younger sister. And he refused to accept that. He refused to label himself as something he knew he was not. And he knew if he accepted that plea deal, it would ruin any chances he could have of getting a scholarship or even getting getting accepted into his dream college. So, at 17 years old, Genarlow Wilson made a decision that would define everything that came after. He chose to fight, and the trial that followed would become a national story and headline. In February 2005, Genarlow Wilson stepped into a courtroom facing serious charges. By this point, 2 of the original charges had already been dropped, and it was clear early on that that R-word allegation wouldn't hold in court. But one charge did remain: aggravated child molestation, based solely on that video evidence left from the party.
At no time did you tell that young lady that she had to give you oral sex?
No, sir.
During the trial, Genarlow tried to explain himself to the prosecutor. Quote, "Sir, you don't even know me. I understand you're just doing your job, sure, but I mean, how would you feel if you were my age and you were put on the stand with these serious charges at this young age? I have a little sister. Why would I molest anyone, sir?" The night before his trial wrapped, Genarlow went to a nearby church to pray, trying to steady himself for whatever the next day would bring. And when the jury returned their verdict, it was almost unbelievable to everyone in the courtroom. He was found guilty of aggravated child molestation because, technically, under Georgia law at the time, the age of consent was 16.
The sentence would be 11 years with 10 years to service.
And as you can imagine, the courtroom was stunned. One juror even cried, realizing that the verdict had sentenced a promising young life, a promising young man, to a 10-year mandatory minimum, a punishment none of them had fully grasped when casting their votes. Several others later said that they were shocked by just how severe his sentence would be. For a teenager like Genarlow, a high school senior with his whole future ahead of him, it was a sentence that felt impossible to reconcile with the kid everyone knew. The star athlete, the top student, the teenager who had made one mistake that most would have considered part of just simply growing up. Genarlow, as you can imagine, was shocked, crying in court, aware that the 15-year-old girl had repeatedly stated the act was indeed consensual. But under Georgia law, anyone under 16 cannot legally consent, meaning the law treated the situation differently than common sense might suggest. Even though the girl involved had repeatedly, again, said that the encounter was consensual on both ends, the law didn't see it that way. Under Georgia law, anyone under 16 cannot legally consent to sexual activity, which meant that despite what seemed reasonable to everyone in the courtroom, the system treated Genarlow's actions as a serious felony. Along with his mandatory 10-year prison term, he was also required to register as a lifetime sex offender, a label that carried consequences far beyond the prison walls, including restrictions that would prevent him from living with or even seeing his younger sister, something he had always tried to prevent from the very beginning. Even with the weight of the mandatory 10-year sentence looming over him, Genarlow stayed true to his convictions. Prosecutors offered him a plea deal for a 5-year sentence, but he refused, saying this: "It's all about doing what's right, and what's right, and what's wrong is wrong, and I'm just standing up for what I believe in," he said. Other young men involved chose to accept plea deals, serve shorter sentences, and were eventually paroled. But Genarlow stood firm, determined to fight for what he believed was fair, even if it meant facing the full consequences. And that's the thing. He refused the plea deal that his friends took because that would have put him on the sex offender registry. Again, after all, he knew in his heart that he didn't belong there, and he still wanted to be able to see and be around his younger sister. That was the reason he chose to go to trial in the first place, to fight a conviction that he felt was unfair. But despite his decision and the circumstances, the jury still found him guilty, and the mandatory sentence stood firm.
Didn't you know it was wrong?
No. I mean, I didn't know sex was wrong, and I definitely didn't know, being with someone 2 years under me could cost me 10 years in prison.
Can you believe you allowed a video camera to be used that night?
I can't believe it. It was stupid. Like you said, sometimes teenagers do stuff that make them seem like they don't have brains. But, I didn't have knowledge of it until really the next day. That's just the influence of alcohol.
This case became highly polarizing because it exposed a loophole in Georgia law. The statute was designed to protect children from adult predators, not to punish teenage peers engaged in consensual activity. Yet the law treated Genarlow as an adult criminal for a sexual act that, by social standards, was a normal teenage experience. The situation sparked national outrage, legal debate, and calls for reform, as it highlighted how a technicality in the law could destroy a young person's life completely overnight.
That was my whole reason for, not taking a plea. I mean, I just can't live with the label. I couldn't live with it then, I can't live with it now.
You might have to.
Yeah, but I really don't think of it that way. I'm prepared to fight forever how long it takes.
This kid really didn't do anything that other teens aren't doing everywhere. Whether we like it or not, teens are engaging in consensual acts of sex and oral sex and other acts. This was not a violent case. This was completely consensual and voluntary. And how you can send to prison someone for 10 years with no parole and label them as a sexual offender for the rest of their life when they didn't do anything that a high percentage of kids are doing is insane.
And what made Genarlow Wilson's case so shocking, so bewildering to anyone and everyone who later learned the details, was that Georgia actually did what's commonly called a Romeo and Juliet law, designed to protect teenagers who are close in age from being treated like adult predators when they engage in consensual sexual activity.
It's not something that they flash on the news, and not even on the teenage stations.
Yeah, that's right.
Nobody is making a movie, about it. You get movies, not to rob, shoot, kill, sell drugs. They have advertisements, say no to drugs, but nobody is saying, you have abstinence laws, where, they advertise, don't do this and don't do that, protect yourself, use condoms, so on and so forth. But, nobody's saying, okay, well, you can go to jail and get a life sentence for this. It's not being advertised at all.
But in this case, that protection didn't apply. At the time, the law only covered vaginal intercourse, not oral sex, which is what Genarlow and the 15-year-old girl had engaged in. On top of that, the law only protected minors who were both under the age of 16 or within certain narrow age gaps. Because Genarlow was 17, the law offered no shield, and the act was legally classified as aggravated child molestation, carrying a mandatory 10-year minimum sentence. Even though the encounter was consensual and between teens close in age, the technicalities of Georgia law meant he was treated as a serious offender, a reality that left many people stunned when they learned the details of this case. And that technicality, that single narrow line in the law, is what turned a consensual encounter between a 17-year-old boy and a 15-year-old girl into a legal catastrophe. Under Georgia law at the time, teens close in age could engage in consensual vaginal intercourse with minimal consequences, usually a misdemeanor, probation, or community service. But oral sex was treated completely differently, because that makes sense. Even though Genarlow and the girl were just 2 years apart, the law classified the act as a felony. When that video surfaced, prosecutors treated Genarlow the same way that they would a violent adult offender, and his life was changed forever. The jury had no idea what the mandatory sentence was when they found him guilty of aggravated child molestation back in 2005. And when they later learned that they had accidentally triggered a 10-year no parole prison sentence and mandatory sex offender registration, some of those jurors supposedly said publicly that they were stunned, even horrified. Yet the law left the judge no choice. Because of this technical loophole, an ordinary teenage experience became life-altering and very permanent. The gap, that strange contradiction in Georgia statutes, is what thrust Genarlow in this case into a national firestorm. The outrage over his case grew so loud that lawmakers eventually changed the statute by 2006, extending the Romeo and Juliet protections to include oral sex between close-in-age teens. Now, this new law reduced the punishment for consensual teenage sexual activity to a misdemeanor with a maximum 1-year sentence and no sex offender registration. But, unfortunately, the new law wasn't retroactive, so Genarlow's convictions stood. These new protections wouldn't be enough to clear him of his sentence, which is crazy. It wouldn't help the young man whose story had actually forced the state to reconsider its own rules in the first place. And so even after the law change, Genarlow Wilson remained behind bars, trapped by a punishment nearly everyone, including some of the people who had convicted him, believed was never meant for someone like him. I want you to think about that for a second. Genarlow Wilson, a 17-year-old honor student, football star, homecoming king, just got 10 years in prison, mandatory, and a lifetime on the sex offender registry. Why? All because for consensual sexual activity with a girl just 2 years younger than him. Even the mother of that 15-year-old girl involved spoke out, saying that Genarlow should never have gone to prison in the first place. She would later admit that the encounter between her daughter and Genarlow and all the other teens in that motel room that night were all consensual, and she regretted not pushing prosecutors to drop the charges initially. I felt like Douglas County was trying to make an example out of these boys, she said. They should have been made to pay for their actions, but not to this severity. Now, according to her, her daughter never wanted any of this to happen, and that she had believed her child was attending a supervised New Year's Eve party, not a motel gathering where alcohol blurred judgment and things spiraled out of control. She even testified at the trial, pointing out her daughter on the videotape, though her daughter herself did not take the stand. As you can imagine, people across the country were stunned. I was stunned just researching this case. This case and Genarlow's sentence sparked debates about teen consent, mandatory sentencing, and the fairness of sex offender laws. For many, Genarlow became a symbol of how a single law written for protection could destroy a promising young life overnight. After being sentenced, Genarlow Wilson was sent to the Alburis Correctional Training Center in Forsyth, Georgia. A promising teen now trapped behind bars for something that, in the eyes of many, should have been a normal teenage experience. From prison, he and his attorney began a long legal fight, challenging his conviction and arguing that Georgia's law was misapplied. The statute that landed him in prison was meant to protect children from adult predators, not punish teens for consensual sexual activity amongst their peers.
Today, I am joined now from Atlanta by Genarlow Wilson's mother, Juanessa Bennett. She has led the campaign for her son's release. We welcome you to Democracy Now!
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Can you tell us what happened? How it was that your son, at the age of 17, who engaged in consensual oral sex with a 15-year-old, the 15-year-old's mother reiterated in the last few weeks that her daughter had engaged in consensual sexual encounter, how he ended up in jail?
She admitted from the beginning that it was consensual. I don't know really how the prosecutors came to the conclusion that there should be charges. According to a law that was in effect back then, the girl was not old enough to consent to any form of sexual behavior. The law has then been changed where it would be a misdemeanor, not more than 12 months jail time for this type of action, but it was a law that was in effect at the time. When I came forward, I thought the prosecutor would use his discretion to try not to make this into as big as it has become. We never imagined it would be this big, but just like I said, the law was changed in '06, and it is now a misdemeanor, and that's the reason why we're still fighting, because we just can't understand how you can land 10 years prison time for something which is, quite as simple as this. Since then, his, outlook on life is definitely different than, the teenager that first went in. He has high hopes and high goals now. I'm not even quite sure if athletic ability is, at the far, it's not quite as important to him as it is now to try to help other youths to overcome some of the tragedies that they are going through, because it's so many other people who are out there who's, even at the rally on Saturday, it was several people who walked up to me, and I'm not quite sure what I can do, but was just begging for help, in certain situations that they felt like they shouldn't have been in.
He was an honor student?
He was a B+ student. He had a 3.2 grade average. He was first ever homecoming king for Douglas County. He was prom prince. He was all conference in football and track for more than 2 years. He had received several letters for certain colleges, mostly Ivy League schools, that were interested in him coming to go to school with them in the fall.
Before the appeals were even resolved, prosecutors offered Genarlow another plea deal that would have allowed him to be released earlier. But again, it came with a catch, that he would again have to register as a sex offender for life. But again, Genarlow refused, knowing the lifelong stigma and restrictions this would impose. And as he continued to fight for justice, this case drew national attention, sparking outrage from advocacy groups, media, and even prominent leaders, including Barack Obama, who publicly criticized the severity and injustice of this sentence and of this case.
We'll be the country that credibly can tell dissidents in the prison camps around the world that America is your voice. America is your dream. America is your light of justice. But that, again, means we've got to lead by example, which means that if you've got Scooter Libby not serving any jail time, but you've got a young man, a young football player who didn't even commit a felony, who's being locked up for 10 years, then it's harder for you to say that you stand for justice in America.
And many other high-profile figures spoke out as well, including former President Jimmy Carter. Civil rights leaders, including Reverend Joseph Lowery, Jesse Jackson, Dr. Francis Johnson, and the Congressional Black Caucus, criticized the Attorney General's appeal and highlighted what they say were racial and legal injustices of the case. At the same time, some activists even questioned whether Genarlow's attorney and supporters fully considered the victims' perspectives. The NAACP even organized marches in Douglas County, Georgia, demanding justice for Genarlow Wilson, focusing on the unfair treatment they say he received.
CTV 25, this is Angelo Muhammad.
We're here today for Genarlow Wilson, a young man who was sentenced back in 2003 for consensual oral sex with a 15-year-old. At that time, Genarlow was 17. This charge should have only carried a sentence of 12 months, a misdemeanor. Yet Genarlow Wilson is doing 10 years. Not only Genarlow Wilson, we're here for all of the youth who make up the Douglasville 6 who fall under that same sentence, walking around with ankle bracelets on, sex offenders for life when they should just be a misdemeanor. We're here because Douglas County's district attorney, David McDade, should himself be prosecuted. He was brought up on sexual harassment charges, and he should recuse himself. We're asking that he step down. In fact, we're asking that Judge Emerson step down.
Today I'm here joining with thousands from across the state of Georgia to stand up for justice and to stand up for Genarlow Wilson's freedom. This is an occasion that we get an opportunity to demonstrate and to march and to tell those in position of power that our voices will be heard and that justice would not be silent, particularly anywhere there's an injustice in the great state of Georgia. I'm here joining with my fellow legislators in supporting this event and supporting the call to free Genarlow. Not tomorrow, not next week, not next year, but to free Genarlow now. Thank you and God bless you.
I'm a retired lieutenant from the Federal Bureau of Prisons. I have 16 years of service. I worked at 6 institutions, 2 federal institutions and 2 state institutions. I have worked inside the belly of the beast. I know how when a person from the outside get incarcerated, they also get labeled. So when they get out, they can't get no job, no education, anything of that nature. So when I retired, I decided to use my experience as a retired lieutenant to go out and speak about the racial disparity in the sentencing guidelines, just like Genarlow Wilson, the mandatory minimum. And my job, and I usually go up to Congress and I normally lobby to try to eliminate the mandatory minimum and teach people what the mandatory minimum sentencing laws are doing to affect a whole generation.
We want justice! Always justice! Always justice! Always justice! Always
His case was even appealed to the Georgia Supreme Court, which twice initially refused to even hear it, leaving this young man behind bars while the legal fight dragged on. But after years of appeals, petitions, and public pressure propelled by his mother, his determined attorney, and the outrage from the public, the Georgia Supreme Court finally decided to step in this case.
There's always a chance that he can go, not with a felony conviction. No, he wouldn't be able to obtain the education that he, deserves to have. But I think it's a good chance that he'll be able to go back in. He's way behind. He'll have to do a lot of catching up, maybe a whole lot of summer school. But I think he still has a chance. And now his major has, mostly he was in focus towards the medical field before. Now it's sociology, and fields like that, or political economics or something.
His lawyer pleaded at the news conference that was held when the judge ordered his release for the Georgia Attorney General not to appeal the case. The Attorney General did, so it's going to be in Georgia Supreme Court on Friday. What do you expect from this?
I think the Supreme Court at this point will be fair, just as fair as the habeas judge, Judge Wilson. I was really shocked at Thurber Baker's request for an appeal. Way shocked. Actually, I didn't take it very well at all, because he has children and he knows what children engage in. And I was just more shocked at the moral standards for this to come through, because as it was said before, Dave McDade passed out tapes to try to keep Genarlow incriminated. I really don't even understand it seems like it's a personal vendetta as far as him trying to keep him locked up. Several people have came publicly and said no one was hurt behind it. And now that the young lady's family is speaking out saying how, they never wanted this to happen, I really couldn't understand Thurber Baker's reasoning behind making filing an appeal. But it's just led to other reactions, and it's so many people coming forward now who is questioning their abilities. We've never said that we condone this type of behavior. My son was definitely, made bad judgments of character. He definitely was not in his right state of mind. I don't condone the drinking or the hanging at that aspect, but it was definitely nothing that deserved 10 years, maybe some kind of rehabilitation or something to teach a lesson, but nothing extreme like this.
And then came the moment that would finally change everything for Genarlow Wilson. On October 26, 2007, the Georgia Supreme Court, in a narrow 4-3 decision, ruled that his 10-year sentence was considered cruel and unusual punishment and ordered his immediate release.
We win!
Yes, he's out.
The majority opinion made it clear just how monumental this was. The court pointed to the new law, which had reclassified oral sex between minors as a misdemeanor rather than a felony, and calls it a seismic shift in how the legislature viewed consensual acts between teenagers. The opinion noted that the harsh felony punishment and lifetime sex offender registration imposed on Genarlow Wilson, quote, make no measurable contribution to acceptable goals of punishment. Essentially, the court was saying what so many people across Georgia and the country felt. This was not the same as adult predation, and treating a 17-year-old like a hardened criminal was completely out of proportion. Justice Lee Ward Sears, part of that majority that voted to free the young man, said this: although society has a significant interest in protecting children from premature sexual activity, we must acknowledge that Wilson's crime does not rise to the level of culpability of adults who prey on children. For the law to punish Wilson as it would an adult with the extraordinary harsh punishment of 10 years in prison without the possibility of probation or parole appears to be grossly disproportionate to his crime. This was a vindication, a recognition that what happened to him was, in fact, a miscarriage of justice, and for Genarlow Wilson, a chance to reclaim the life that had been put on hold for him far too long. The Georgia Supreme Court ultimately reduced Genarlow Wilson's conviction to a misdemeanor and his sentence to 1 year, actually giving him credit for the 2 years that he had already served by this point. He was freed, and most importantly, he no longer had to register as a sex offender. A lower court judge had already called his original punishment a, quote, grave miscarriage of justice, and had tried to reduce the sentence to 12 months. But it took the Supreme Court to finally make it official.
Yes, he's out. Read us what it says. Can you read it to us?
Writ of habeas corpus is granted. The sentence is void. This has been a really long 28 months. It's a very long fight. And right now, we have an order of release, and I beg the Attorney General of the state of Georgia, please, enough. Do not file an appeal, please.
But even though this felt monumental, not everyone agreed with this decision. The dissenting justices pointed out that lawmakers hadn't made the new law retroactive, so changing Genarlow's fate wasn't necessarily what they intended. The majority countered that they were not applying the law retroactively, but rather ruling that the original punishment itself was unconstitutional. Douglas County's District Attorney, David McDade, said this: "While I respectfully may disagree with the court's decision, I also must respect their authority as the final arbiter in this case." But outside the courtroom, Genarlow Wilson's supporters saw it differently. Congressman John Lewis, who had long backed him, said, "It's been a long time coming. Each day that this young man spent in prison was a day too long." Jesse Jackson called for an end to mandatory minimum sentences, and lawmakers helped raise money for a scholarship fund in Genarlow's name, with Jesse Jackson pledging an additional $5 grand. The Georgia Legislative Black Caucus even created a college fund for him. For many, this wasn't just a legal correction, it was a moral one. The Supreme Court's decision didn't erase the 2 years Genarlow lost behind bars, but it finally acknowledged what so many had been saying all along, that the law had treated a boy like a predator when he wasn't, and the system had failed him. The court was at least saying out loud what the public had already knew. This entire case became a symbol, an example of how a single legal loophole could destroy a young life overnight, while also showing how public attention, advocacy, and perseverance can force a legal system to confront its own injustices.
So many times I kind of contemplated on why I went through this experience.
Genarlow Wilson had every reason to be bitter. At 17, he was a standout athlete and student, but his life took a sidestep. In 2005, a jury had found Wilson guilty of aggravated child molestation for having oral sex with a 15-year-old girl during a 2003 New Year's Eve hotel party.
But even behind bars, Genarlow Wilson never lost hope. He believed in the system, trusted in the kindness of others, trusted that things would work out. And he had faith in his attorney, B.J. Bierstein. "It definitely helped me mature," he reflected later. "I said I'm not bitter because I've learned how to turn negative images to positive. I plan on doing a lot of positive things. I want to help others, talk to a lot of youth, troubled teens, try to help them learn from my situation." When Genarlow Wilson finally walked out of prison, it was a moment of freedom that he had spent years imagining, a chance to reclaim the life that had been put on hold. That morning started like any other behind bars, a routine day of waiting, wondering if justice would ever arrive. For months, he had held on to hope, but the exact timing of his release remained a mystery. And then suddenly, without warning, everything changed. Word spread through the prison, first from another inmate who'd heard it over the radio, and before he could fully process it, he was walking toward the exit he had once feared he might never see again. Outside, his mother was waiting for him with open arms, excited to be reunited with her son. As you can probably imagine, she had envisioned this moment countless times, yet when it finally happened, she was able to hug her son again.
And she was like, "Get up and get dressed." And I was like, "What? What is going on?" And I was just screaming. I ran around the house, inside the house, 20 times before I can decide what I needed to do. And then I was like, okay, well, I need to wash my hair. Okay, I need to brush my teeth. And then I was like, BJ, I don't have any clothes in my closet.
So tell me when you were convinced and felt a sense of freedom for the first time.
Well, actually, they gave me a card. It's a release card, and then that's when my patience really kicked in. I had to just sit down and wait that out until my attorney and my mother got there.
And believe it or not, but Genarlow didn't want to dwell on the years he had lost or the opportunities that had been taken from him. He knew that he wanted to turn a painful chapter of his life into something that could help someone else. He spoke without bitterness, but with the kind of clarity that comes from truly understanding the weight of one night and the consequences that followed.
I mean, it's just a whole new beginning. It's like I got fresh breath now, so I got a new life, so all I can do is start from today and move forward.
And we went to the courts. We've been fighting in the courts all along, and the system does work. The Georgia Supreme Court is not going to speak or give press conferences this weekend. This is the time he needs, but we're also thrilled that this isn't going to happen to any more other teens in Georgia. This is never going to happen again.
Not just me, but all of us. We made decisions that I felt like could have been better. But, I feel like we've all learned from that experience. All we can do is move forward. You can't step back.
So on a day that had started like any other, Genarlow's life shifted, not just back toward freedom, but toward purpose. What should have come years earlier did finally arrive, a chance to reclaim his life and use his experience to guide others, making sure no other young person pays the price that he did for a mistake made before adulthood. He walked out not just to regain his life, but to redefine it. After Genarlow walked out of prison that day, the community that had fought for him made sure his story didn't fade away. At a local NAACP fundraiser, hundreds stood as he entered the room, honoring not just his freedom, but the courage it took to stand his ground when a plea deal could have made his path easier. The chapter that had spent years advocating for him presented an award, recognizing the strength that it took to face an unjust system and refuse to let it define him. Free Genarlow had become more than a slogan. It was a national rallying cry, a symbol of how a broken system could consume a young teenager. The West Metro NAACP had been one of the loudest voices demanding justice in this case, and now they were celebrating the Georgia Supreme Court's decision. That moment captured something bigger, how a boy once labeled a criminal became, for so many, a symbol of resilience, of fighting for fairness, and of the power of standing firm, even without asking for the spotlight.
2.5 years in prison as a sexual offender, maximum security. What's it like?
It was very difficult for me, especially having to accept that I was labeled as a sex offender, basically a predator. But that's something that I never gave myself that label. I accept the situation that I was in.
But the sexual offender label makes you what people would refer to as a child molester. That's a heavy rap, isn't it?
Yes, sir, it is. It's something that, I never would have allowed myself to be, or be labeled as. So, it was difficult for me, just to be incarcerated for something of that nature.
Did you cry?
In the beginning, it was so hurtful, and just to know how I was being labeled and treated and what I was being portrayed as, yes, it forced me to shed tears numerous times.
Most people would say, 17-year-old guy having sex with a 15-year-old ends up with 10 years in prison, hard time, rapists, murderers, labeled a sexual offender, child molester. That ain't right.
Of course, I believe that it was absurd, but, I had to look at it that, these gentlemen were doing their job and, they felt like that they were carrying out the law. And, as prosecutors, and you have to maintain an image of being tough. So I don't place the blame on any of them. We did everything that we had to do throughout the court system, and justice was finally prevailed.
But Genarlow's dreams went beyond just starting a job. He had always wanted to go to college. And finally, in January 2008, he was able to walk into the campus of Morehouse College as a 21-year-old freshman, carrying with him the weight of a felony conviction, but also a determination to finish what he had started years earlier. College for him wasn't just a classroom, it was a whole new world, and the staff recognized the challenges that he faced. The dean of that school guided him through his transition, helping him adjust from life behind bars to the rhythm of campus life. But it was obvious that Genarlow's drive and potential were just too impossible to ignore, and the Morehouse community welcomed him with open arms. He even received a full scholarship from the Tom Joyner Foundation and was determined to transform what was, quote, a minor past setback into the foundation for a brighter future for himself.
Regardless of what has happened in the past, he's a human being. And I believe and I expect him to march on this Central campus one day, not 5 or 6 years, but I expect 4 years, to be a Morehouse graduate.
But going back to school wasn't a smooth ride for him, not completely. Even with a full scholarship, which helped him attend Morehouse, despite his past, he had to adjust to academic life all over again. At the beginning, classes felt challenging, dorm life felt unfamiliar, and he had to rebuild basic study skills that he hadn't used in years. But Genarlow didn't just stop at getting back into college. He pushed through, and eventually he completed his degree. And after graduation, he actually began working as a detention technician with the DeKalb County Sheriff's Office, monitoring inmates and officers. You would assume that he wouldn't want to come back to a system that had failed him from the beginning, but he knew he needed to use his story and his case to help others, to make a difference in the lives of others, to use his pain for good. He also shared the long shadow of what followed after prison. A lot of people think my story ended like a fairy tale when I walked out of prison that day in October 2007. But little did they know, and I didn't at the time either, that the second leg of my sentence was just beginning. It took 7 years, 7 long years, for me to get that felony off my record, and many people discouraged me from even trying. My success was almost 100% due to my own personal drive and passion to get this off my record. But it still affects me to this day in terms of housing, employment, and how I support my family. Unfortunately, I know the real truth, the dirty truth about re-entry back into society after you've gone to prison. It's the scarlet letter that keeps on giving. After earning his degree and rebuilding his life, Genarlow Wilson has turned his experience into a powerful tool to guide and inspire others, recognizing that he has a second chance at life and he wants to pay it forward. Today, he dedicates himself to mentoring teens who might find themselves in situations like the one that he faced. He works full-time in education, helping young people make smarter choices, take control of their lives, and avoid the mistakes that nearly derailed his own. He now sees his story as a lesson for more than just youth. He wants parents, educators, legal professionals, community leaders, and anyone concerned with justice to pay attention to his case and what he's gone through. Through speaking engagements and school programs, Genarlow continues to share his story with students nationwide, discussing the real dangers of drinking, drugs, and risky teenage sexual behavior. His mission is clear: to ensure other young people have the support, the guidance, and the tools to navigate life without paying the heavy price that he once did. Genarlow's journey has been one of pain, perseverance, and ultimately redemption. Once a naive teenager facing a decade-long prison sentence, he has turned his experiences into a mission to mentor and guide young people, to mentor the next generation. Even after the Georgia Supreme Court overturned his original sentence back in 2007, and even after graduating from Morehouse College, his path wasn't easy. But through it all, he has focused on turning hardship into hope, using his story to teach, inspire, and ensure that other young people don't have to pay the same price that he once did.
I was able to go to college, graduate, but I was still, I had an uphill battle that I had to fight. I was still practically, I changed the law, but it wasn't made retroactive, so it didn't apply to me, so I was still a felon.
Genarlow Wilson has poured his energy into giving back and even founded the nonprofit nicknamed HOGS, standing for Helping Others Generate Success. Through the organization, he sponsored families at Christmas, holidays, organized back-to-school events in DeKalb County, and even returned to the prison where he was actually held to mentor other juveniles, providing them with hygiene items and even food. Beyond his nonprofit, he works with the city of Atlanta through through Restore Atlanta, continuing to mentor youth and expand his own impact. Every single day, Genarlow Wilson guides young people to make better choices, take responsibility, and understand the consequences of their actions, all while showing the power of hope, forgiveness, and the ability to turn hardship into purpose. And despite all the work he's done giving back, mentoring youth, and building his own nonprofit, his proudest role has since been becoming a father. He now has 3 children, and fatherhood has become the heart of his life, a chance to guide, nurture, and share the lessons that he's learned through. He is committed to being honest and open with his kids about his own past. Through fatherhood, he wants to teach his kids that while everyone indeed makes mistakes, it's the way we move forward and the example that we set that can shape lives, heal wounds, and inspire those around us. It's almost impossible to imagine the life Genarlow Wilson might have had if that night in that motel room had never happened. One moment, he was your typical high school senior, football games, college dreams, the kind of bright future every teenager imagines for themselves. Then, overnight, a single night of youthful exploration turned his world upside down, replacing promise with the weight of a decade-long prison sentence and the label of a sex offender. The freedom, simplicity, and opportunities most teens take for granted were gone in an instant just like that. But over time, Genarlow has rewritten that narrative for himself. He became a devoted father of 3, a full-time educator, and a tireless mentor. He transformed a personal tragedy shaped by legal injustice, public scrutiny, and lost time into a life of purpose, using his experience to guide and inspire others.
I went through this purpose for a reason. You know, I went through this situation to be an agent of change.
For Genarlow, his story isn't just about what was lost, but what can be gained when someone refuses to let adversity define them. From a teenager whose life was nearly derailed by an unfair law to a man shaping the next generation through mentorship, education, and advocacy, his journey is testament to human resilience. Even in the darkest moments, it's possible to reclaim your life, redefine your identity, and turn hardship into a source of strength and inspiration. Today, Genarlow Wilson's life is full, meaningful, and devoted to service. And it stands as proof that tragedy doesn't have to be the end of the story. It can be the start of something far greater.
I would say this is the beginning for me because I still look to do a whole lot more.
So what do you make of this case? Strip away the headlines, and it's a story that countless teens across America can relate to, maybe even you. 2 teens, close in age, engaging in consensual sexual behavior. No coercion, no lies. The girl herself said it was consensual, and yet Genarlow Wilson paid the price. 2 years behind bars, a 10-year mandatory sentence hanging over him, a felony label he never should have carried, the threat of being branded a sex offender for the rest of his entire life, all for something that, for most teens, is simply part of growing up. His bright future flipped in one night, a night that could have happened to almost any kid. Any one of us. He wasn't perfect, he was reckless, he was just a teenager, just like she was, doing what teens do. The difference is that he ended up paying with his own freedom. But that painful chapter sparked something bigger: outrage, national conversations, and change. Georgia's laws were rewritten, and people across the country rallied behind him, insisting what happened in this state was injustice. It was a warning. And here's what matters most. Genarlow didn't let that darkness define him. He's been able to turn the worst experience of his entire life into a blueprint for helping others. He speaks to teens who are standing where he once stood, confused, pressured, unsupported, one decision away from a life-altering mistake, and shows them that there is another way. He teaches them about choices and also about consequences, about how quickly life can turn in an instant and how hard you have to fight to turn it back. He teaches them that one mistake also does not make you a lost cause or define you. Genarlow shouldn't have been locked up. He shouldn't have been labeled as a sexual predator. He shouldn't have had to lose years behind concrete walls. But because he lived that reality, he now gets to change the reality for the next generation and for his community. In a strange, heartbreaking, hopeful way, his story has become exactly what he says it is: a testimony, but also a warning, and most of all, a second chance paid forward. Because one thing is certain, Genarlow Wilson's case is a testament that a single moment can rewrite a life, but with courage, community, and compassion, it can also rewrite the law, the future, and the lives of those who follow.